All right, so today we're going to talk about geographic maps. Now, to orient you for where we are in our big picture, remember that we talked about ways of visually encoding data, and we started out by talking about tables. Then we went on to talk a bit about interactivity, but now let's come back to talk about a different kind of data. Today, we're going to talk about instead of expressing quantitative values or separating categorical data and then ordering and aligning it into different spatial regions, which was really focused on the idea of tabular data. Let's now talk about the case where we're going to use something that is given to us, that is spatial position. So when would we want to use spatial position? Well, if we've got a spatial data set, that is, if the data set contains attributes that are intrinsically spatial and those have primary importance, then if we've got this central task that revolves around understanding spatial relationships, that's really when we want to use given spatial position. Our main focus for today is going to be on geographical data, something like state borders on a map or provincial borders or country borders. Now, not all data is geographical, but that is what we're going to focus on for the most part today. So we're going to want to use geographic visualization if the data set contains geographical attributes, and understanding that spatial relationship is an important task. Now, a data set might contain geographical information. On the other hand, it could be that we wouldn't necessarily use that for the position channel. So the key question is, does the given spatial, or in this case, geographic data matter for my task? Remember, position is the most effective visual channel. We don't want to waste it for non-relevant geographic spatial information. So always ask yourself, do I need a map? Do I need a geographic map? It's not always what you need. Sometimes it is. So the great advantage of maps over other kinds of representations is it's familiar. People know where something on a map is. Of course, if and only if they're familiar with the region. But if they are, then maps act as an index from spatial to semantic information and vice versa. So in this case, what we're doing is we're visually encoding given spatial geometry as marks using the two-dimensional position channels rather than choosing position freely, as we talked about a lot when we were using tabular data. So this is a really famous example. Some of you might have seen this before, some of you might not. What this is all about is a cholera map. So in London in 1854, there was this outbreak of disease, and it was not yet understood what the causes of that were. What John Snow did is mapped deaths as bars on a geographic map. And what we can see here is that there were cases clustered around a water pump in the middle, and that this gave evidence to support the idea that there was something happening that was a spatial phenomenon. This is actually one part of a more detailed statistical analysis, but the point is you could see on the map something is happening that seems to have spatial characteristics. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about a geographic map? Remember, we had this idea of different kinds of marks, point and line, and these interlocking marks. So in a geographic map, we're really very focused on using these interlocking marks. They are shape coded and area coded and position coded, right? They interlock like jigsaw puzzle pieces together. It's important to note that you can't encode another attribute with any of these three channels when you're dealing with interlocking marks. They're already taken, right? We can't just move Canada way over here into Asia, and while we're at it, spin it around and shrink it down. That wouldn't mean anything. So these things are given. Now, in the language of cartographers, that is, people that have studied map making for hundreds and hundreds of years, these are often what we want to think about as thematic maps. And the idea is that we're trying to show the spatial variability of an attribute, that is a theme. Um, and so one way to think about this, if we're kind of thinking about data sets, is that we're combining a geographic map. Sometimes this is called a reference map in cartography. We're combining that with a table of data, typically like a simple flat table. So we're really joining together these two very different ways to think about a region. One way to think about a region is one of these interlocking area marks, right? Like the provinces of Canada, or the outlines of a country. These are things with shapes. Sometimes we also have things like cities that we could consider like two-dimensional lat-long coordinate, where the location of the latitude and longitude actually is a way to index again into geographic data. But the key thing is that whether it's these regions that are interlocking area marks are also a way to look data up in a table. So a region is also a categorical key attribute that we can use in a table to look up value attributes. So sometimes there's confusion about, well, is a region this area mark? Um, or is it an attribute in a table? And the answer typically is it's both. And it's joining together the two of these that really gives you the power of thematic maps. So today we're going to talk about some of the major idioms for looking at thematic maps: choropleth, symbol maps, cartograms, dot density maps. So let's have a look. We're going to start with choropleth maps. So what are these? Here's actually the earliest choropleth map. Here's one created by Charles Dupin in the early 19th century. So what are we doing with the choropleth? We're taking a quantitative attribute and we are encoding it with color. And what we do is we just take the region and we color. In this case, it's black and white. Of course, we could use brighter colors as well. So the point is that the region is determined by using some sort of given geographic geometric shape, and then within that shape, we color code. So here's a much more contemporary example from Vancouver a few years ago in the census. Um, and what I want you to notice is, right, we have all these little regions. These are little geographic regions, and they're colored in. Here we can see on the bottom what color scale we're using. We'll be talking more about color next time. What's important to note for here, right, we seem to have some sort of a sequence from white up through purple, multiple steps along the way. And so we're able then to read off from this color something about an attribute. In this case, the attribute we're seeing is simply population density within the city of Vancouver. All right. Now, what is good and bad about a choropleth map? So one really nice thing about this is they're straightforward, right? They're easy to read, they're easy to understand, they don't require a lot of explanation, very, very well established, so there's not this learning curve. Um, and what's also nice about this approach is often data is really collected and aggregated according to these geographical regions. So in some way, it's a very natural thing then and understandable to simply color code within that region. Okay, so what is not perfect about these? Well, for one thing, we're sort of using up position, right? The most effective visual variable, the most effective channel, is being used for geographic location, which means we can't use it for anything else. But there's something even deeper, which is an issue here, which is the visual salience of things depends on the size of the region. And that might not really be the true importance if we're thinking about an attribute value, right? There might be something with a really high value of an attribute that's a little teeny shape on the screen. And then there's very few pixels that are available to color code it. So there's this fundamental problem that large regions are going to appear to your eye to be more important than small ones. And that's a fundamental issue with choropleth maps. It's also worth pointing out that the color palette choice is going to have a really big influence on the result. And even though we're not going to get deep into color today, let's at least look at some examples of how this works. Now, I could tell you that this map is showing the same data set, but it doesn't look the same. So What's going on? Here's some nice examples from Gregor Eisch, formerly of the New York Times, that really dove deep into Choropleth maps. So what's going on here? We've just binned these differently. So notice how on the left here, we've got a very distorted class distribution. At that beginning one here, we're actually not even going all the way. And notice what happened here. You know, this one is 6 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to 15, right? So these are 3 each, but now suddenly it's more than 3 in this larger bin. So the distribution is not equal. All right, what do we got on the right? We've got something that's more reasonable. We've got something that is equidistant, right? Between the min and the max value, it's chopped up into equal bins. And what's worth noticing is we see different patterns here because we are using these different color scales. So we see a pretty large influence of color scale. So one question is, let's use equal size bins. But let's also think, how are we actually color coding these bins? Something that's really strange here on the left is, you know, if you just don't even look at the map yet, look down at the legend, something very odd is happening where we've got quite a jump between bins 1 and 2. And then there's again really a big jump between bins 4 and 5. It's actually almost impossible to tell the difference between 3 and 4. Um, and in contrast, we have a much more equal sized perceptual jump as we go from this sort of light pink all the way through to dark maroon on the right here. And so the argument is that's actually a much more reasonable way to have a color palette, which is probably going to be more veridical, more true at showing the data. And again, you see quite different patterns in these two maps. In fact, Aisha actually did a nice little progression where we went from 2 classes to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. And the point is that the number of bins is an interesting variable. There's a fundamental trade-off between, you know, accuracy or correctness, right? How fine-grained of the data can you see? And color distinguishability, right? It's very easy to tell apart, you know, the pink bin from the maroon bin with 2 classes. It's trivial. By the time we get up into 8 classes, it gets a lot more subtle. We'll talk about these issues more next week. What I want you to note is just that it gets hard to compare the more of these classes we have. So we're going to have some questions about, you know, how many bins can we get away with these Choropleth maps. All right, now here's another thing to watch out for. Choropleths are very, very often really, really highly correlated with populations. Here's a great XKCD comic. There is an XKCD for almost every data visualization principle known to humankind. And the question is, sometimes if you have a choropleth map, you're really just showing populations, and then everything is correlated with everything else. Because you haven't normalized by population density. Now, this is actually a specific example of something that's much more general. When should you show absolute counts versus when do you have to show something relative? That is when you need to normalize your data. So a really common error with Choropleth maps is that you haven't normalized, right? If you're just encoding raw data values that are tied to something like an underlying population, then you typically would want to use a normalized value, right? You might, you know, divide by unemployed per 100 citizens or, you know, something like that. So another thing you might want to do is maybe derive new data, right? You might derive a ratio like the growth between one year and another. So really be careful when you're using Corpus to think about normalization issues so you don't draw false conclusions. So some recommendations for choropleths. Typically, you would use them only when the central task is in fact understanding spatial relationships. That's true for all thematic maps. You normally in a choropleth would show only one variable at a time. We'll talk a little bit about bivariate color maps next week, but they get quite tricky. When appropriate, be very careful to normalize. Be careful when you choose your colors, when you choose your bins. And because of that disparity in region sizes, the best case for choropleths is when your regions are roughly equal sized. And the more variability there is in your region sizes, the more hazards and limitations there are to using choropleths. All right, what's another approach to thematic mapping? Let's look at symbol maps. So the idea of the symbol map, as the name kind of suggests, is we use a symbol. And you're typically representing some sort of quantitative attribute that encompasses the entire region. So typically that would mean it's aggregated. We'll talk more about aggregation in a few weeks. And that symbol, what is it? Well, it could be a mark or a glyph. On this page, we're looking at marks. And so what's nice about this is we can use these other channels, right? Not only can we use color like we use for choropleth, but we can use size and shape because we have one mark per region. Sometimes these are called proportional symbol maps or graduated symbol maps. We're just going to call them symbol maps for short today. And so what do we do? Well, we keep the original spatial geometry in the background, and then instead of color coding the region, right, that outline, we just add a mark, and then we're able to size code that, or color code that, or both. So these are often a good alternative to choropleths because we don't have that problem where the small regions actually just vanish, right? We could see here that there's some small New England states, and we're still able to see the circles. Now, what's actually going on the East Coast? I mean, there's a lot of circles that are actually partially on top of each other, right? Same here for these Christmas trees on the right. So we see that there are some issues where there seems to be, in fact, quite a lot of these symbol overlaps. So that brings us to, we could have glyphs instead of marks, right, where we have more complex structures. Here we're seeing a little sort of stylized mini bar chart for every state, or here we're seeing little pie charts for every region, in this case, in Germany. And so fundamentally, symbol maps are somewhat intuitive, maybe not quite as intuitive as a choropleth, and they really do mitigate the problem with region size versus data salience, right? Because the symbol size follows the attribute value, typically when you're using marks, and if you're using glyphs, then you can have uniform symbol size, and you don't run into that problem where the small regions get overshadowed. What's not perfect about these? Well, as we saw, there can be occlusion or overlap, right? So the symbols could occlude each other, or the symbols could also occlude region boundaries, which can sometimes be a problem if you really need to understand extents. And of course, if your glyphs are complex, that actually might require explanation or training. All right, let's talk about a third kind, cartograms. So here we're looking at a world map, and now what's happened? We have distorted the size and the shape of all of these geographic regions so that the area is directly encoding some attribute, right? Some data variable. So again, that's the undistorted and that's the distorted. So things have changed size and shape according to this variable. In this case, we're just looking at population, and this is what's known as a contiguous cartogram. Here's another one, right? With this one, we've mapped one attribute. We see one set of distortions. And with this other one, where we're looking at the gross domestic product instead of the population, we're seeing a very different view, right? In one, we have China and India being very large. In the other, we have the US being very large. So we've done this distortion based on these two different attributes. Okay, so what is going on with this idiom? Well, again, we've got this idea of interlocking marks. And now what we're doing is we are deriving new interlocking marks. And that is based on the combination of the original set of marks and this new quantitative attribute. So it's pretty notable that you typically would want to do this algorithmically. I mean, in the old days, people might do this by hand, but of course it was incredibly labor intensive. This is something we would typically do algorithmically. And the key thing is we have to create these new marks sort of all at once. We don't just do it one by one. It's a global problem where the input to the algorithm is this target size that is a new quantitative attribute. And then there's a goal that you're trying to maintain the shape as close as possible to the original. And you're wanting to maintain constraints, right? Like the relative position. You want to make sure Canada's always stays on the top and the US beneath it. And you want to have contiguous boundaries with their neighbors. So you really do have to do this global computation. Here's another few examples: greenhouse emissions, child mortality, right? So we're seeing these very, very different distortions of the familiar shapes. Okay, what are the pros and cons? Well, they can certainly be sort of engaging and intriguing. People often say, "Hey, what's that?" and start, thinking about it and talking about it. And really the best case for cartograms is where you've got, quite strong and maybe even surprising disparities in size. It's not something where you're going to be able to see, really, really subtle changes. They're going to have to be fairly significant to be noticeable. Now, the problems with cartograms is you have to know the original data set. You need to be substantially familiar with it, and you have to use your internal memory, because what you're actually doing, you're comparing the distorted marks that you see to your memory of what they should look like. So for one thing, you have to know what they should look like, or it's going to be very difficult to make any sense of it. Now, there could be mitigation strategies. You could have animated transitions that go from an original to this distorted one. You could have side-by-side views of an original and the distorted cartogram. Another issue with cartograms is this really major distortion can be quite problematic. I mean, it can be just aesthetically displeasing. And, at an even deeper level, it might result in marks that just become unrecognizable. Um, And certainly it can be difficult to extract some exact quantity, right? You might not be able to notice if something is like, 8% bigger versus 13% bigger. That might not be easy to read out the way it would be in, say, an aligned spatial position kind of a thing like a bar graph. Now, there's some interesting alternatives to contiguous cartograms that still fall into this general umbrella of cartograms. So, for example, the Dorling cartogram is where you have a circle that represents um, a region. And so then you can resize the circle according to this attribute that you're using as input. So at one circle per region, you basically have this sort of much more stylized approach. The goal is not to be fully realistic. You sort of relaxed, obviously, a bunch of the space constraints, right? And so Texas is no longer the shape of Texas. It's a circle, just like every other state. But we can see, because we're trying to keep the constraints about relative spatial position, that you can often read off quite a bit about that. So, here's one of the US, here's one of England, and these are actually pretty recognizable. There's a variant. The Demers cartogram is where you use rectangles rather than circles. Same idea. Here we see the US. Here we actually see a map of Spain, Spanish regions on the right. Now, even more abstract is a grid cartogram. And this is where you've got some sort of uniform sized shapes. Like in this case, we're looking at squares that are arranged in a rectilinear grid. So in a regular structure, we see some squares, we see some circles. And the idea is that, again, we've got this constraint. We're trying to maintain an approximate spatial position and approximate relative positions in the arrangement. But they're quite approximate. But notice how we still are able to discern some of the structure here. And finally, a hex cartogram, a hexagonal cartogram, is also the idea of a grid, but it's uniform sized hexagons. And so then you really are able to maintain quite a few border adjacencies between the hexagons. Here we see a few examples, including one of the same ones of the US, of these hex cartograms. Now, in general, the non-contiguous cartograms are typically much, much easier to understand. Particularly the hex cartograms seem to be a a nice trade-off between something that's more stylized and regular versus something that's more familiar. And so anytime you can have these uniform sized regions, you're going to have the sort of benefit of regularity and of the ability to really track things and not have some parts get lost. All right, let's talk about dot density maps. So with this idiom, what we're doing is, well, we're visualizing a distribution of some attribute by placing dots where one dot represents some constant number of items. Um, and so, I say dots, right? That means these are going to be small point marks. They're going to have uniform size, uniform shape. But what we can still do, I mean, in addition to, seeing dense regions, right, noticing just the number of objects we have on the screen, we are still also allowed to use the color channel for dot density maps. And so these can be quite good for tasks like understanding spatial patterns and trying to spot clusters. Here's an example of a color-coded dot density map where it's color-coded by the first digit of the zip code. So, and what are we able to see? Well, it's really clear where a lot of people live versus where few people live. This is a certain number, dots per, you know, 10,000 or 100,000 residents of a county. Um, and we're really able to notice how the East Coast is much more densely populated than the American West. We're able to see, cities in the Midwest as these concentrations of dots. So we are able to read off a lot of structure from this. Okay, what are the pros and cons of dot density maps? Well, again, these are actually pretty straightforward to understand, certainly more straightforward to understand than the cartograms. And they're avoiding the non-uniform region size problems that we had with the choropleth. Okay, so what are the challenges? Well, some of the same issues hold as with choropleths, right? Normalization. I mean, we saw even on this previous one, this dot map was just directly representing the population density of the US. That's the same problem we ran into with choropleths. So, typically a lot of the target attributes that we would want to visualize are strongly correlated with population density instead of the effect that we're actually trying to study. So it's a similar problem. Now, it can be difficult to extract the quantities. Typically with dot maps, you're not trying to go for absolute accuracy and precision, but to get a general gist of things. And then on the implementation side, keep in mind that if you're actually trying to render, say, 10,000 dots or more, you might actually hit some rendering issues as you try to scale up. So that's something to be aware of, even more so than a lot of the other visualization methods we've talked about so far. Let's talk a little bit about map projections. So with map projections, well, what are we doing? We have to somehow get from the surface of a sphere onto a flat two-dimensional surface. Um, and so, there's a lot of different functions that could allow us to do this kind of mapping, this kind of projection. And it's intrinsic that something has to be wrong, right? There's got to be some sort of distortion of a surface. If you're going from a curved geometry to a flat geometry, well, something must get distorted. Either your angles get distorted, or your areas get distorted, or you actually can't keep things continuous and you're going to have gaps in between. So there are a lot of different trade-offs here. There's a rich and glorious mathematical history of map projections. I'm not going to follow these links now, but I'm going to encourage you to play around with them yourselves and look at some of the many different projections and think about what their pros and cons are. What kinds of structures are you able to see and notice? What are you not able to see and notice? When would you care about making sure the area stays correct? When might you care more about the angles? Does it matter if there's actually completely contiguous things, or can you get away with some of these other projections where there's actually these convex or concave regions? So one thing to note is the Mercator projection, which is probably the most familiar, is one of those ones that really heavily distorts areas. So the closer you get to the North or South Pole, the more that these sizes of countries are distorted. Here we see on the right an example of what the true undistorted size would be. Canada, although it is big, is not quite as big as it looks on these maps. So, I mentioned this one in particular because it's often the default in a lot of packages. So you will want to think carefully about whether it is the right projection for what you're doing. What's great is that D3 has a boatload of projections that are built in, many, many, many projections. Mike Bostock is a great lover of map projections, I'm happy to say. And so there are many, many choices. So you don't always have to just go for some default. You can actually think carefully about what map projection is relevant for your problem. For example, are you looking at a large chunk of the world, or are you zoomed much further in and actually doing much more local kinds of computations? So you can pick a projection that is appropriate for the problems that you're trying to solve. Again, I'm not going to click through this at the moment, but I encourage you to go through and have a look at that. Now, let me also mention an implementation issue, although we've been mostly high level in this lecture. This one is worth talking about, this idea of a tile map. So in a tile map, the idea is that instead of saying, all right, here's my map, it's one big giant picture, and here it is, you're actually going to divide a map up into many much smaller images. These are the things we call tiles that are of fixed size. And then from a computational point of view, there's a lot of benefits, right? In order to display, you're only going to need the tiles covering the current geographic area, right, of how far back the camera is. Remember how we talked about cameras and viewports. And so with a camera that has a fixed viewport, you're only going to need some of the tiles. And also, it depends on your zoom level, right? How far zoomed in are you? One feature of maps is that we also really do need to do quite a bit of zooming out and in and out and in for a map, depending on what how big of a geographic region we're looking at. So in order to support that kind of zooming needs, this software architecture where you actually are storing a large number of uniform sized tiles and then swapping them in as needed, where in fact the size of the tile is going to depend on the zoom level in terms of the amount of real world area it's covering compared to the number of pixels it takes. So when we say fixed size, we mean fixed number of pixels as opposed to fixed geographic extent, because that geographic extent of the certain number of pixels is what's going to vary. Typically, these are image files, like a PNG file. These days, sometimes vectors are being used for performance. And you've definitely seen this in action. I'm sure you use Google Maps. That's an example of an architecture that is using these kinds of tile maps. Now, for an open source version that some of you might want to use for your final projects, leaflet.js is a pretty easy to use framework. And it works with OpenStreetMap tiles. So that means that that's an open source data set, open source software. So that might be something that people choose to use. And now the key thing is, in addition to this, which we can really think of as the reference map, remember the base geographic map, then you could add on top, right? You could add symbols or any arbitrarily complex D3 visualization as a superimposed layer on top of the background. So remember how last time we talked about foreground and background layers? This is an example where to actually draw a thematic map like a symbol map, it would make sense to have that as a foreground layer on top of a background layer, which is the base reference map. All right, so that was a quick walkthrough for a lot of different thematic maps. What else might we care about? Well, one thing is, so here's a somewhat different variant of maps, a topographic map. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we still have this idea that there is some geometric file that actually tells us crucial information about the geography of something. Maybe it has outlines, maybe it has things like roads and cities. But what we also have, remember how we talked early on with data about this idea of a spatial field, and a scalar spatial field is where we have one attribute that we're dealing with for each of the places. We can think of, in this case, typically a regular grid where we are sampling. And in this case, what are we sampling? We're sampling the height above sea level. So for a bunch of points, systematically, a whole bunch of points on this two-dimensional map, we have this third number, which is the height above sea level. Now, what's going on? We see a lot of lines on this map. What we've done is we have derived new data, these so-called isolines or isocontours. It's where you actually compute a line where there is an equal value of the scalar value, which in this case is the height. Um, and so we're able to see these boundary lines that aren't the boundaries of geographic regions like cities or countries or provinces like we saw before. Instead, they're the line of equal height. And then what we're able to do is to actually understand something about the shape of the terrain. In regions where there's lots of lines really close together, that means there's a very steep gradient, right? You're going up or down a hill very quickly. And then we can see in these large regions that don't have many lines at all, that's where things are very flat. And of course, we know that the blue is the sea, and so that gives us some sense of, what are things near sea level. Now, what's good about this approach is, we're only using two-dimensional spatial position here. This is a 2D layout. We're able to avoid a lot of the challenges with 3D, and we'll be talking about those in a lot more detail in a few weeks. Um, And it's also notable that that means that the color channel is something we can use for other attributes, right? In a choropleth map, we aren't able to color code anything beyond the attribute that we're using for the choropleth. Here, we're able to actually leave the color channel available for mapping some other attribute, not just the height. That's what we're showing with these lines. Now, of course, the downside is there's, significant clutter from these lines. And so we would be, less able to see any other thing that's color coded on here. So not impossible, but there is substantial clutter from all the isolines. All right, so we've really been focused on geographic data. Um, let's remember that there is non-geographic but still two-dimensional spatial data. And a lot of this might be happening, say, at smaller scales, right? Here we see an example of shot maps from basketball. And then you're really thinking about, the scale of an indoor arena, right? So you're not thinking about, the outline of the province of British Columbia. You're thinking about, the region inside a sports stadium, or maybe something like floor plans of a building. So a lot of the same issues do hold here, where you still have this question of there's data that you're given that intrinsically has spatial structure, and then do you want to use that as the basis of what you draw in your visual encoding? And there's many cases where that actually makes sense because spatial regions matter. Like to understand the shot structure of baseball, it's crucial to know where these shots are taken with respect to the basket and these lines that determine the point counts. All right, so we've gotten to the end of our quick tour through maps. There is a huge amount of useful and glorious stuff in the cartographic literature that we don't have time to cover in this class, but at least this gave you a little tiny taste of some of the issues this was chapter 8 in the VAD book, and also drew on some other sources like Jeff Hare and Enrico Bertini in Hans-Peter Pfister's class. All right, bye for now.